These are a group of stories from Reedsy's short stories. This first one is Surrounded by the Darkness by Malin Kell. It's a suspense adventure fantasy story. You can't run forever, the cold shout cackle echoed throughout the stony chamber. Fear, silver and icy, washed over Phelan. The fast, warm pulsing of blood pounded in her ears. Her fingers gripped the cold stone behind her as her eyes darted across the dark recesses of the cavern. Her heart beat desperately like a trapped bird trying to escape its cage. Phelan tried quieting her breath, but she could barely focus. "Come now, little rabbit." The familiar voice echoed louder in the chamber. "How much longer are you going to make me wait?" The sickly breath was now directly in her ear. "No." Phelan sat up abruptly, gripping her heart. Hot tears were streaming down her face. Her eyes blinked rapidly as they adjusted to the darkness of her tent. She tried controlling her breath as she quickly looked around the small space. Panic arose, then dissipated as reality sank in. Phelan brought her knees up to her chest, her arms limp at her sides. She sat there in a puddle of sweat-soaked sheets in a daze. The darkness of her tent pressed in on her as she finally placed her head in her hands. Another dream, no vision. She blinked in the darkness. Her brain was numb from her subsiding panic. She felt her heart pick up again. That voice. Why did it sound like... No, she thought. There is no danger. There can't be. This must have been a nightmare, that's it. The dark feeling slithered back into her thoughts. But why did this feel like last time I had a vision? It happened right before Serene... No. She shut down that train of thought. Reopening old wounds was too much to bear right now. What time is it? Maybe a few hours until dawn. She considered waking up the others, or at least Lyra, but she decided against it. What would I even say? She sighed and pulled on her cloak and fastened the belt that her sharp obsidian dagger was fixed to. Drawing in a deep breath, she quietly opened her tent and stepped out into the chilly night air. The fire at the camp had gone out, and Ulrich lay there, slumped next to the cold ash, mouth wide open, fast asleep. Phelan gently kicked his boot, untusked. "Out cold. Some lookout we have." She crept around the rest of the tents and made her way to the edge of the camp. She climbed effortlessly up a rocky overhang that opened to a clearing. Phelan sighed as she looked down at the expanse of treetops below and sat on the edge, letting her legs dangle off. The air was sharp and clear. Blue moonlight showered the landscape in a luminescent glow. As she looked up into the starless sky, her mind began racing with her past tormenting visions. Am I responsible for what happened to Serene? It was the same question that turned over and over in her mind countless times since that fateful night. She felt a tear roll down her cold cheek and quickly wiped it away. Suddenly the distant snap of a twig reached in her sharp elven ears, and she couldn't help but smile. "Okay, you can come out now, Lyra." The clumsy fumble of small feet sent rocks tumbling down below. "Dang it!" A quiet chuckle came from behind Phelan. "One of these days I'll sneak up on you." The petite form of a gnome girl stepped into the moonlight clearing, brushing off her dusty cloak. As soon as Phelan turned to meet her gaze, the gnome smiled widely and tiptoed her way over. She sat down using Phelan's shoulder as support and peered down over the edge of her barely dangling feet. Her kind face peered up at Phelan. "So, what you doing out here?" Lyra's eyes, like bright blue orbs, glimmered in the moonlight. "I thought I heard a shout from your tent, and then I saw you leave." Phelan stiffened for a second and then sighed and looked out of the treetops. "Sounds to me like you didn't sleep very well either, Lyra. Are you having trouble sleeping again?" Phelan looked up and noticed the light in Lyra's eyes flicker for a second as her smile faded and she looked down at her hands. "Oh, yeah, it's been hard ever since, well, you know." "Yeah, I know," Phelan answered. She felt a sudden flush of warmth as Lyra placed her tiny hand on her arm and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Is that why you came out here tonight, Faye?" Lyra stared up at her intently. They sat there for a few seconds in silence. "Yeah, something like that," Phelan sighed and looked up into the empty darkness. "It hasn't been easy." She glanced at Lyra and saw that her eyes were shiny with unspilled tears. "Oh, Faye, it feels so wrong having her gone," Lyra burst out. "Like a part of my soul was taken with her. Everybody feels it too. But I know you're the only one who feels the same way I do." Phelan felt a lump swell in her throat and she looked away. Lyra continued, the tears falling down her cheeks. I just feel like I could have known. I should have done something. I can't stop thinking about where the plan went wrong. Faye, I could have saved her. Don't blame yourself, Lyra. You did nothing wrong. There's nothing we can do now. We can't bring her back. Phelan's voice broke on the last word. Shifting uncomfortably, she cleared her throat and looked down at Lyra, who was wiping her eyes and softly sobbing. Should I tell her about my visions? No, I can't. I just can't. It would break her even more if she knew that it was my fault, that I could have saved Serene. Phelan closed her eyes and regained her composure. She slowly unclasped her thick black cloak and put it around Lyra's shivering shoulders. Lyra sniffed and accepted gratefully, and Phelan couldn't help but think she looked like a child gripping onto her favorite blanket. You should probably get back to camp and try to get some sleep. I'll wake up Alric and keep watch for the rest of the night. As Phelan started to get up, Lyra caught her arm. Faye. Lyra was no longer crying. She looked up at Phelan with a stern expression. I know that there's something important you're not telling me. Damn. Perceptive as ever, Phelan thought. You know, you can tell me anything, right? There was a second of silence, and then Phelan smiled and gave Lyra a gentle pat on the head. Of course, Lyra, I'll tell you if there's anything that comes up. I just haven't been feeling myself lately. This mission's just got me feeling a little on edge, that's all. Lyra softened a bit. Yeah, I feel the same way. I fully trust Corin, but something feels off. I can't explain it. She looked back at Phelan. If there is something, though, you'll tell me, won't you? Of course I will. Now, we should be getting back. They carefully made their way back down to the camp. They had to stop a few minutes so Phelan could help Lyra over the jagged rocks. The campsite looked the same as they left it. Everyone was still sleeping in their tents, and Alric still lay by the cold campfire. Lyra handed Phelan's cloak back, gave one last smile, and disappeared into her tent. Phelan shrugged on the cloak and walked over to prod Alric awake, who grunted loudly, then gratefully shuffled back to his tent. The rest of the night continued uneventfully as the sky turned from purple to red and finally to pink and orange as the sun peeked over the mountains. As expected, Corin was the first to emerge from his tent, arms outstretched with a wide grin on his face. His golden hair shined in the light of the morning sun, not a strand out of place. Ah, Phelan. Finished the rest of the night's watch, I see. Even got the fire started again for breakfast. She nodded silently and took a bite of her sausage as he strode over, opening his pack. Corin rifled through for a minute, then pulled out a breakfast sausage and sat down. Today is a big day, Phelan. We're finally back in business. You do remember you're part of the plan, right? Does it ever change? Phelan said flatly. I go in first and scout it out. Astrid follows behind, and then you, Lyra, and Alric follow behind her. Ha! Yes, good. Hey, we can never be too safe, right? Corin held his eye contact for a second longer than Phelan did. Yeah, of course. Corin smiled and clasped Phelan on the shoulder. Hey, today's going to be a big success. I can just feel it in my bones. We're going to be rich. He released his grasp and clapped his hands together in excitement. Not to mention, we'll be on the Chancellor's good side after bringing back this artifact. I can't wait to see how he'll reward us. Remembering his sausage, he happily chomped away as he continued rambling on about the plan and how it might all turn out. Phelan couldn't help but feel her stomach twisting in knots. Something is just not right. The memory of the familiar cackle flashed suddenly before her again, and the hairs on her arm stood up. She only realized Corin was still talking when he suddenly gasped dramatically. My speaking of our mage, here's our mystical beauty joining us for breakfast now. Astrid, a stunning purple tiefling, emerged from her tent, jewels and delicate silver circlets shining on her horns. She smiled and gave a twirl. The bangles encircling her wrists clinked together, and her slender form danced gracefully over to Corin, who kissed her hand as she sat down. My, what a vision you are, my dear. Oh, Corin, love, you do know how to flatter, don't you? As if on cue, Phelan got up and walked away quickly to her tent. I cannot listen to those insufferable lovebirds this morning. She got inside the tent and zipped it up, muffling the sounds of the giggling couple. Phelan sat twirling her dagger in her hands over and over mindlessly until she heard the announcement from outside her tent that they were ready to pack up and be on their way. The group packed their tents quickly, aside from Alric, who was bleary-eyed and constantly yawning. Lyra, who had put on her full armor, picked up her sword and playfully poked at Alric's large foot. Hey, stop all that yawning, big guy. You're like an illness spreading through the camp. Lyra yelled up at the orc. Elric smiled down at her and bonked her on the head with his great fist, which sent her flying straight down onto her bottom. From a distance, Phelan leaned against a tree and smirked as she watched the pair play fight. Whispers caught her sharp ears, and she peered to her left, where Corin and Estrid were deep in a quiet conversation. They both looked serious, which was an unusual change from their light-hearted demeanors. Phelan saw Corin's eyes dart over to her, then back at Estrid. She tried, but couldn't make out what Estrid was saying, and then suddenly the conversation was over. "Everyone, let's be on our way," Corin said, showing 2 rows of pearly white teeth. Alric and Lyra stopped punching each other for a second to listen. "We're not far from the place. According to our instructions, we just keep heading straight north for a few hours." Phelan watched Estrid closely, who remained slightly turned away with a concerned expression on her brow. Corin turned to Astrid, and she looked up at him and smiled back. Phelan continued to watch the pair as everyone prepared to leave. Corin and Estrid led the way as the group walked. They only stopped to have a quick lunch before continuing on their journey, trudging through the dense forest. Lyra kept pace with Phelan in the back, and they walked mostly in pleasant silence. Phelan always felt more at ease with Lyra around, but as they walked, she couldn't help but feel slightly anxious. The fleeing seemed to grow as they continued on, getting closer to their destination. Phelan felt her forehead break into a light sweat. "Hey, Lyra, I don't know what's going on, but—" "Aha, everyone, here it is," Corin interrupted loudly. The whole group stopped suddenly as Corin held up his hand. "It's clear right here. The markings we were told to look out for. Astrid, darling, would you mind revealing the entrance if you can find it in this mess?" In front of them was a great stone wall covered in moss and thick vines. Underneath, barely visible, was a large, strange symbol etched into the rock. As Astrid began to cast a spell and clear away the vines, Lyra turned back to Phelan. "What was that, Faye? You don't know what?" Phelan stood there still as a statue, gazing at the stone wall. I don't know, honestly." She was telling the truth. Her mind seemed to go completely blank as she stared at the stone wall being uncovered. She remembered there was something she was finally going to say to Lyra, but the harder she thought about it, the more it slipped away. "Yeah, I don't know, Lyra. I can't remember." Lyra smiled at Phelan and chuckled. "Hey, you don't know what you don't know." Phelan smiled back, but she couldn't help feeling slightly unsettled. Dang it. There was something. Why can't I think? Astrid, with one last stroke of her hand, finished clearing the stone, and before them stood a doorway 10 feet high with the now visible rune etched in the middle. "Beautifully done, my dear," Corin exclaimed. He stood in front of the doorway and looked down at a piece of paper and read aloud a chant in a tongue unfamiliar to Phelan. When he was finished chanting, the rune glowed at a bright blue color, and with a loud scrape, the stone door began retracing upwards. Everyone stared curiously as the great entrance opened up into pure darkness. Corin jumped in the air with excitement. "We've done it! Now for the easy part. There shouldn't be any trouble snooping around this cave. But we shall follow protocol and send in first our elven friend, whose eyes are admittedly better than mine." He winked at Phelan, and she felt a gentle pull as if the entrance was drawing her in. She walked over dazed-like to the entrance and slowly made her way across the threshold. The air grew immediately cold, and she felt a sudden shockwave hit her. Wait, no. She remembered everything. The uneasy feeling was overwhelming. Just as she was turning back to tell the others this was a mistake, the high stone door collapsed with a great crash, sending her flying back into the darkness. It was pitch black. Stone and rock and dust sprayed her as she lay coughing on the ground. In the complete darkness, her eyes could barely make out the walls around her. "No, this can't be happening." She scrambled to her feet and ran to where the stone entrance was. There was complete silence. "No!" she yelled out loud this time. "Phelan!" She whipped around at the sound of Serene's voice coming from the darkness. She was paralyzed with fear. She couldn't speak. "Phelan, where are you?" Serene? Barely more than a whisper escaped her lips. Complete silence surrounded her. "Serene?" Phelan pinned herself against the stone wall and slowly inched her way further into the darkness. This next story is called Killer in the Woods. It's by Kajsa Oman. This is also from Reedsy. "Just do it," so the t-shirts say. "Just pick up the gun, pull the trigger, but maybe aim first. Aim it the upper sternum, and then pull the trigger, congratulating yourself that at last, in your long, passive life, you have shot somebody dead. So she did, and thus became a murderer. She slipped through the night after that and disappeared into the willows to wash off any blood that spattered onto her clothing. The willows were thickly interlaced with an overpowering smell, acrid and watery. The stream followed through and among them. She washed her hands and face, even her elbows, and pushed her way through the restraining arms of willows wherever she could find a gap. The ditches were deep. Sometimes she put a foot down in one and fell, grabbing at willows to drag herself back up again so she could keep running. How long could she run and where? Pretty soon the willows ended by the bank of a creek that was swift, dark, bitter, cold, and deep. Can't run there. Run down along the shore, scraping under a barbed wire fence, not running, but walking or stumbling, because there seemed no rhyme or reason for the contour of the ground in the dark. There was faint moonlight from a half moon. She was afraid she would be seen in it, even though she didn't know if there was anyone to see her. Had there been another besides the one she shot? He couldn't have been alone. She was sure he had heard them talking, short grunts of laughter, murmurs of discovery. Where was the other? Was it possible he was out looking for her? He'd be scrambling, that's for sure, not knowing the territory, confused and annoyed by the scratching of resistant willow twigs that sprang back and slapped the flesh. Her shoes were wet and heavy. Every step sucked mud. The sound of it traveled through the quiet night until she couldn't imagine she wouldn't be caught. If he caught her, she was dead, probably worse than dead. It didn't pay to think a lot about how much worse than dead a thing could be. She needed all her thought to be on the escape. In whispers, she told herself how she was coming along, kept a running commentary on what a good job she was doing, and gave herself warnings about dangerous footing or sudden patches of open space. She thought about how she hadn't bought the gun. Maybe not bringing it meant he would have it now, but she couldn't have gotten as far as she had if she'd been saddled with trying to work the rifle barrel through these branches. And there was still one bullet in it, so she might have shot it off, shot her own foot, shot an advertisement of her location into the night sky. But now maybe he had the rifle, and it did have one bullet in it. He would not find any stash of ammunition because there wasn't one. The 2 bullets had been all, and if he came after her, he would have one more trouble than she would have had traveling through the willows, since he didn't know them and she did. Or maybe he was a fisherman, in which case he would be perfectly familiar with willows and know how to penetrate them without becoming immovably trapped in the twist and winding of their slippery, springy fingers. Maybe he was a fisherman and a woodsman and was right now somewhere behind her, close behind her even, holding the rifle high, worming it through the spaces like someone from a movie. When she paused, she thought she could even hear that, an occasional snap where a foot bent a branch and broke it off, an occasional wet splat as from a foot pulling out of a mud ditch. Then she was in the willows again herself, and the breath was so painful in her pressed lungs there was no room for another. She had to stop. She could and should stop. It would give her a chance to listen and know for sure. She was safe here in this thicket, as safe as a deer, as safe as a fawn curled up among the branches while its mother went away. She opened her mouth with a big round O and let the breaths come in, large and noiseless, go out the same. Not quite noiseless. There was a shaky panting sound she couldn't repress, but it might not be heard over the white noise of the creek straining through the willows. And now that she wasn't running, she had to think. She had to remember. It made her eyes dilate in water to remember the horror she'd felt when she first heard them walking across the gravel. Those grunts of laughter, murmurs of discovering, she could hear them clearly now. She could remember the creaks on the stairs from her own feet carrying her up to the point 30-30. She remembered the clucking sound of the lid popped out of the nearly empty cardboard ammo box, the dreadful click as she opened the magazine and slid the 2 bullets in, closing the lever, that sound that had been covered by a sound from downstairs, a sharp hello. Then there was the sound of them clumping from room to room, also a moving flicker from their flashlight. She thought she'd remember seeing the one all of a sudden appearing at the top of the stairs. Oh, yes. She'd been pressed against the wall listening to their progress, and they'd been quiet too, maybe scared themselves, maybe awed by the size and emptiness of the house that wasn't theirs. But she never saw the other. She saw the one. First the circle of his flashlight, and then the form behind it. She saw the light beam search her bedroom from side to side. She felt it cross her body and rapidly return to it, then aim directly at her face. "We're not alone," called his voice, sing-song, and she hated the voice. It contained so much of her own fear like a hideous magnifying mirror, and she knew without waiting another second that he would do her great harm. So she aimed at the part that would be the upper sternum because once she had seen Rick shoot a standing bear that way. When she pulled the trigger, the man made the same sound the bear made. Shoo! And the flashlight thumped across the floor. There it lay, shining in the place where the bureau leg stood on the carpet. In the ensuing silence, which was staggering, she had set the gun down, picked up the flashlight, and shone it on the body. It was dead. There was no other word for it, for the way the eyes were up and sideways in a gaze no living eyes could hold. There was the blood, much of it seeping out from under the man. The boy, almost, she remembered now, a big overgrown boy, his lifeblood seeping onto her carpet, which was, or had been, beautiful and precious to her, so that she felt an even greater anger. Anger that she had been forced to kill this kid who'd lived so short a life. Anger that her carpet was horrifyingly blood-soaked. Anger that she had acted from fear without weighing the choices. All her hair had been standing on end. That's how it felt, though it couldn't actually have been because her hair was too long to stand on end. She remembered the surge of electricity that had come rushing through her when the deed was done, how she crouched with her mouth wide open in wonder and thought, "I have killed somebody. He is lying here dead and I shot him." It was a feeling of victory beyond anything she'd ever experienced, instantaneous certainty that she ruled the world, on the heavens, victory that lasted a minute or less and was replaced by sickening panic. Where was the other intruder? Was he crouching downstairs, not breathing, wondering if he was dreaming, wondering if he would be next? Had he run away? But she could not go down and find out. Not only that, she couldn't go down and escape, because maybe he was there, waiting. Yes, probably he was there. She would have to let herself out through the window, with the twisted sheets tied together the way she'd never thought she herself would actually be doing. And she'd have to do it so quietly the other wouldn't hear or see. This she couldn't do. But she had tied the sheets and let them out the window, securing the end on the hat hook. Then she had grabbed a little suitcase, crept with it all the way to the other side of the house, and thrown it through the other window, shattering the glass. If the other was still there, he would surely go in the direction of the sound, or at least his attention would. Then she tiptoed back, balanced on the edge of her own window, and let herself down the sheets as quietly as she could. When her feet touched the ground, she waited for many minutes, for maybe 10 minutes, and never heard whether the other was there or not. She heard nothing. That was when she had made a run for it, across a small slope of meadow to the nearest clump of willows, praying all the way, spurt by spurt, until she reached the main growth where the willow branches enclosed and hid her. How could she have done this? How could she have done any of it? She had not known, so she thought, how to load the rifle. She had not known how to fire it. She had not known how to descend on a twist of sheets. There had been something working in her that was quite unknown to her conscious knowledge of herself, yet apparently fully developed. Developed when in her sleep, all the nights she had been laying sleeping. Was she all that time developing the secret ability to be a killer and an escapee? As she paused again for breath and to listen, she began to see it was more important at this point to run rather than away, to run to. Just running away meant she would have to keep running forever. She knew she couldn't do that. The obvious plan was to go to Seymour's for help. The Seymours were the nearest neighbors, 3 miles down the road. She was sure she had run more than 3 miles, but she didn't know how many of those miles were in a straight line. She thought, though, that the tiny flicker of light blinking occasionally behind the pines might be from their ranch, and when she came to a sweep of pasture land, she was sure of it. She began to run again because the grazed grass made it so easy, and the hope in her heart was expanding like a sunrise. A few minutes later, she staggered into their driveway, panting and heaving, and banged with her fist on the door. They were certainly home, because there was their pickup truck, a Dodge Ram, there. "Well, hi there, neighbor," said Ida Seymour in that way she had of saying neighbor that sounded as if she had learned it in a storybook. "Heavens, you look like you might have ran here." Ida Seymour had opened the door wide for her, so she walked into the mudroom feeling half grateful. Only half. She had another feeling, too, but it took a few seconds for her to pin it down. Do the Seymours drive a Dodge Ram? It was a nasty spark that might or might not go out when it hit the ground. She had a very strong impulse to turn around and keep running. Ida Seymour, however, was propelling her on into the kitchen, talking all the while. "You're the second visitor we've had tonight. You wouldn't guess, but we have this fellow who says there's been a killing up the creek in an abandoned house." Willie told him, "What abandoned house? There's only the one house, which of course is yours. Right off, we thought about you and hoped you were all right. But anyway, Willie's on the phone to the sheriff this minute. Coming in." She came on in. She had to. The man at the kitchen table seemed young too, though older than the dead one. His wheatgrass hair hung down all around from under the edges of his baseball cap, and his plaid flannel shirt was a shirt anyone in this part of the country would wear. He was hunched over, his hands wrapped almost desperately around a cup of black coffee. His face, with its haggard blue eyes, was at this moment raising towards her, and its clammy, unhuman whiteness she saw a reflection of how her own face must look. It couldn't look any other way, a look compromised of shock, horror, revulsion, and naked fear. Willie Seymour stood behind him, the receiver halfway to his ear. He started to lower it, and she saw in his eyes a slow trickle of comprehension. Then that slow trickle seemed to pass from one set of eyes to another, getting less slow by the second, so that she began to fear, as she had feared in the willows. Feared more because she couldn't run. She had already run to the end. Of course she feared. She should have thought of it before. There was a murder in this room, and everyone present knew who it was.